Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Mage Errant Book 3, A Traitor in Skyhold. Chapters 20, 21, 22, 23, and 24. Long overdue explanations, Starfire, Thrones, Ilnya Kandas, and setting the stage. In these chapters, we get some more information on what the deal is with demons. We get to meet Sabae's grandmother, who is just what I was hoping. And we get a conversation with Rhodes, which doesn't go how I thought. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this episode. Dan is here in the chat hanging out, and so is Amek Shard. And this is going to be a hell of an episode. I don't know how I'm going to fit in everything because a lot happens in these chapters. So when we start off with chapter 20, long overdue explanations, this is a kind of a neat thing. Sabae she starts it off and is just like, all right, look. We need to know what the deal is with Bakori, because it's really starting to look like we're not going to get anybody to change their vote. And as we find out later, low-key, it seems like Kandaran thinks they shouldn't get anyone to change their vote. Like, I am really concerned, and I'm not saying that this is true, okay? But I am really concerned that Kandaran is being influenced by Bakori. And I get that that's not supposed to be possible, but I don't really know how this works. And I don't, what I think she believes is that this is something that they're going to have to face at some point, like whatever is going on with him. And perhaps in doing, they could flush the traitor out somehow. But there is a part of me that really was sort of side-eyeing her, like, the fact that she says, well, you're going to have to go into the labyrinth, and then she just flies away. And I was just sitting there kind of like, you're just going to say that and then bounce? Like, I didn't like it. And I get that Kandaran has a whole different level that she operates at. She's 500 years old, actually older than that. So maybe she just doesn't feel the need to sit around and explain herself, which frankly, I probably wouldn't either, I'll be honest. But it did kind of raise my hackles a bit to tell him something like that and then just fucking bail. So let's go back. I've gotten into this. So Alastin says in response to Sabae, all right, we've got a lot to talk about here. So let's get started with this. So you know how ether is made from entropy. And he says sometimes when things completely like run down, stuff happens that's not awesome. And, our universe will eventually run down completely. And we are not the only universe out there. So the thing is that they don't always just run down from natural causes. And then he starts talking about the way that universes can sort of butt up against one another. And I at first sort of thought when he's describing this that perhaps what he is telling them is part of what he was looking for when he was on his little mission. When I say little mission like that, it sounds like I'm being really patronizing. I don't mean to, but you know what I'm saying. Because he is like really looking for the way that the ether is behaving in the places that he is exploring. I don't think that is what was going on, but it made me think that initially. So, universes frequently intersect entirely without interacting. And he says, but sometimes they do interact. And they basically have what's you could call friction, and a hole begins to slowly form. They like wear their way into each other. And Talia says, so does the ether leak through? And he says, no, it doesn't leak through. What happens is that the friction makes more ether on both sides. And he says it's likely for the best, since from what we know, the nature of ether tends to vary wildly from universe to universe. These points of friction are known as mana wells. There are a couple different types of these. A mana well that only connects a couple of universes is known as a lateral well, while one that connects more than that is known as a junction well. And as he's like explaining all of this, he's got these pieces of paper behind him rubbing together in the way that he is describing to them, but he's not fully paying attention to it. So eventually they light on fire, and it seems like he isn't fully aware of that. And then later on, when he notices, he just puts the fire out without any trouble. But it was kind of a moment of me just being like, I don't like this metaphor that's just turning into flames that, like feels like bad news. The membrane separating universes tend to be both thick and strong, so it can take some time for the friction to wear a hole that anything can pass through. Many lateral wells never last long enough to form an actual hole. Junction wells, on the other hand, can form holes much more quickly, as well as producing far more ether density around them. When enough mana wells form in a universe, it starts to increase its ether density to a far greater level than would naturally be possible. And when this happens, things begin to change. More and more creatures start to tap into the ether as a part of their natural life cycle, and life starts to run riot. Eventually, ether densities will get so high that natural law itself will start to distort. And he says that probably a regular human being wouldn't even be able to breathe the air in a place like this. These are the universes where demons are spawned. Their life forms adapted for extreme ether densities, and they're constantly living on the edge of destruction. Which is a wild place to be. Like, the ether density continues to increase, so where they are born, there's a high probability that like they won't be able to continue living there because they will not adapt in time for the changes that happen in their environment, which is wild. When they can escape, they put disproportionate demands on the ether of the worlds they invade, and if the ether can't sustain them, they die. Eventually, ether densities in these universes grow so high that reality breaks down entirely and they collapse. Thankfully, by that point, most of the inhabitants can't survive other universes at all. And he then starts talking about labyrinths. In the midst of this, I should mention, people keep on asking questions, and he keeps just basically like telling them to hold on. He's getting to it. Labyrinths only form on mana wells, and generally only junction wells. So far as we can tell, whoever designed labyrinths designed them to slow down this process to prevent universes from going ether critical. They act as brakes on the amount of ether being generated by mana wells. We're fairly sure the wells can't be plugged, but the labyrinths do an effective job at slowing down the process. Once they've arrived in a universe, they reproduce and plant themselves in mana wells quickly. There's little we actually understand about how they grow or how they work, and even less about their creators, but trying to understand that is one of Skyhold's main reasons to exist. Which is really like, I accept this, but he doesn't really explain what they do to to slow the process down, like in terms of mechanically how that happens. So anyway, they tend to overlay into quite a few other worlds temporarily. Many of the creatures in the labyrinth are drawn in during brief periods and then get stuck there when the overlay ends. Skyhold's labyrinth bars the entrance to the largest junction mana well on the continent of Ithos, and one of the largest on all of Anastas. Bakori wandered into our labyrinth from his own universe, which was going ether critical. His own universe is too ether dense for him to survive in any longer, so he can't flee back there. But if he wanted out, he could have escaped centuries ago. So far as we can tell, he's been down there at least a half century before his battle with Kandaron 200 years ago. We suspect our universe is too ether poor for him to settle in long term. We think that his goal is to shatter the labyrinth, which would massively increase the ether density around Skyhold, giving him a broad territory that he could inhabit for quite a long time. And he says basically the way that he can do that shattering, though, has to be done from outside the labyrinth. So probably it's not something that he is able to do, but, you know, he can manipulate people. It would just take a while. And since Kandaron is large and in charge here, the likelihood of him managing to do this is fairly low at the moment. But then when Talia says, okay, but what are Bakori's actual capabilities? He's like, all right, look, I'm going to have to be honest with you guys. This guy's fucking scary. He's genuinely completely out of all your leagues. The very fact that we all thought Kandaron had defeated him and then he was still fucking around is just what you need to know right there. But he's freakishly strong, which you would think he would be anyway, being 15 feet tall. But let me promise you, it's a lot more than you think it's going to be. And he can cut through most stone and metal with his claws pretty easy. He has venom in his tail sting that can kill most things smaller than him in only minutes. And, you know, even something like Kandaron's size, it's going to be a danger. He can manipulate people's minds, which you guys are all aware of. And granted, it takes a long time for him to sort of wear his way in. It's not like something that he can use in combat, but nevertheless, that's still pretty freaky. And he's always surrounded by swarms of imps, which you have met. And they are not to be taken too lightly. I mean, especially in the numbers that he can wind up spawning them in. And then, if you even manage to do damage to him, he manages to drain the life force out of his imps to heal himself. So, Kandaron once cut an arm off, and he literally grew it back in about 3 seconds. And Talia, who had been trying to sort of bluster the way she does, is even starting to look a little bit like, oh God. But none of that's the worst part. He has an entirely different way of interacting with magic. Spell forms decay around him. The longer you channel mana through a spell form, the more it decays, the less stable it grows. And after enough uses or time, it's no longer stable in his presence, and you become unable to cast any spell more than a few times effectively. So, my suggestion is, if you do encounter him again, run. And that was a pretty good summary. That felt genuinely intimidating. Like, you know, I am not going to say that it's hard to intimidate me with the tales of a bad guy. I am pretty easily intimidated in these regards, especially because I have that lovely aspect of anxiety where I make things worse in my imagination even than they really are by thinking about all the stuff that we probably don't even know that something is capable of. But I think really the main thing for me is the fact that Bakori was supposedly beaten by Kandaron and is still here. For me, that's it. You don't really need to know the details. Like, you do need to know I'm lying. You need to know the details in order to figure out a plan of attack if that's what you want to do. I don't think you should, but if you want. However, if you are simply looking to intimidate and you just tell people Candorum was very confident that she had killed him and it turns out she hadn't and he was just fucking walking around fine, that would be enough for me. I don't need to hear anything other than that and I will be scared. So I already felt this. The rest of it is just whipped cream. It's just a little bit of details that I'm like, yeah, well, that feels right. And they talk about like whether people have gone to other worlds and whether Alustin has specifically. He says he hasn't, but that lots of people have, and that likely we're descended from people who have gone to different worlds. And Alustin says, Galvatrin's the only world traveler I know of. I'm fairly confident Candoran knows of a few more. He apparently just wanders from world to world, writing guides on various topics, bestiaries mostly. He's been active here for a few decades now. Is there any risk of our universe going ether critical? Our world seems to have a disproportionate number of labyrinths. According to Candoran, if it wasn't for them, we would have long since gone ether critical. But no, we should be fine as long as no one starts going around and wrecking a bunch of labyrinths. And I was just kind of like, yeah, as long as nobody... yeah, who would do that? I don't like it. I don't like anytime a character is like, we're fine as long as blank. No. As soon as you say that, it's out in the universe now. You can't take it back. You can't pull it back into your mouth. Stop it. You just said... I'm already so tired because now it's going to happen. I don't... This is a much higher stakes situation than I was expecting. It's not like, oh, it's going to be the enslavement of our race of wizards. It's like the fucking heat death of the universe will be... you know what I'm saying? Like, that just feels like awful lot. That's we're talking Armageddon level, but you know, in a way that feels much less. When somebody talks about Armageddon there's so many properties where that's like a sort of looming threat, but the one I'll go with, which is an old standby, is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The Armageddon is just like human beings running for their lives while demons begin to inhabit the earth and rule things, and we become prey animals and, you know, whatever. And for me, that's always just kind of felt like, well, yeah, that would be terrible. Don't get me wrong. It's not like I want a world like that. But also because I have watched so many like action and horror movies in which people live under those sorts of conditions and manage to get by. I'm like, well, you know, that's still living. Maybe you can eke a life out. When you start being like, oh yeah, and then like it becomes so that the air is too thick with ether to even breathe, and then the world just collapses, that's a lot more specific and a lot more inevitable feeling with a very firm period at the end of the sentence, versus there being almost a sense of like, oh, sure, Armageddon, like the demons take over. But if you're still out here and alive and managing to like create communities and fight back, maybe there's the possibility of undoing what happened. There's always a sense of hope for me if people are, this is not an Armageddon based on like mythological creatures. This is not an Armageddon that's just a paradigm shift of power. This is the fundamental existence of this world is over. And that's very, very different. You know, like this is specific enough that it feels like we're talking about science now. We're not talking about the Armageddon of Revelations. And that is way scarier. So I'm just saying this is a much higher stakes situation than I realized. And like, granted, even in this situation, demons take over for a little while. Like, it's more that they take over until they can no longer survive, probably. And as they start to die out, the world collapses. Like, there's still an end after that. The demons taking over are only a step on the way to the actual closing of this door entirely where our people exist. So, yeah, this is just a really scary situation that is being presented like he's just, I can't decide whether Alestin is really that confident that they're not going to reach a point where they're in that kind of danger, or if he is covering up like a fear that he has because he knows that there's more of a possibility than he wants them to realize. You know, he may just be doing the thing that grown-ups do sometimes and sort of shielding the kids from the worst of it. And I don't think he seems like the type, because he's really put them very much in situations that they shouldn't be in as at their age a couple of times now. So it feels like he estimates their capacity quite highly. But there's also, you know, Alestin has been a little bit shady, as we have seen, and managed to hide things from them. They still don't know about the whole thing with this fucking egg and what's going on with that. I mean, we don't even know really what's going on with that. So, Dan says, which is why I find hard magic systems so much better than soft magic. When you know the rules of magic and they are logical, you can make things a lot more realistic and scary. Yeah, I think that's it for me as well. Is like, it's kind of funny because I have often said that, like, if you're going to if you want to make an effective horror movie for me, not showing me the monster and letting me imagine what the end, like the big moment where you face off with it and imagining what it looks like, is worse, because I will likely come up with a creature that's a lot scarier than what winds up on screen. However, when you're talking about something like Armageddon and the end of the world, if you don't get real specific about what that means, it's going to feel a lot less threatening to me. So it's like a specific monster. It's a known quantity to someone, and I don't need to know what it looks like because I can make it worse in my head, and that makes it more effective a threat. But in terms of the way that people describe the end of the world in a lot of movies and books, there is a vagueness to it that makes the threat feel kind of neutered and just sort of like, well, that's not really the end of the world. That's just a massive change in the world, to the point where I would always kind of get irritated, depending on the property, in the way they kept calling something the end of the world when it felt like it was decisively not the end of the world, actually. And sometimes I felt like that was just a lack of imagination on the part of the writer, or maybe an unwillingness to commit to what that looks like, because they don't know where they're going to take their series in the future and they want to leave doors open for themselves, which I could understand. But like, that's part of what I like about having rules, is that you can still leave doors open for yourself. You just have some restrictions within those rules, and that gives everything a different sort of quality, because it feels like it's not a completely bottomless pit of possibility. There is a bottom to it. It's just that now we know how far down it is, and it doesn't change the fact that you'll die if you hit the bottom. So anyway, when Alestin, he finally gets up to leave, and he was thinking over, I said overthinking, but honestly, true. Everything they had learned from Alestin, when he caught a sharp sense of puzzlement from his spellbook, which was alternating its gaze between the apprentices and Alestin, who had paused by the door. Then Alestin left, and the moment passed. And I was just sort of like, man, what is that? I mean, it feels like he did something, because the book is sort of, the confusion feeling is like not something that we see from the book very often. And I'm wondering if Alustin, because he's inside the wards here, managed to do something that allows him to scry without the wards interfering, because he is within them when he does whatever he does. I have no idea how this works. I just want to always, every time I mention something being done with magic, I want to preface it by saying I don't feel like I have a great idea on how a lot of stuff works, so I could be very, very wrong, but I've got to make my little guesses, you know? That's part of the deal with doing this. So Sabae is like, all right, so now that we know all of this and what we're actually up against, it's time to really get serious about this. And this is when we go to chapter 21, and this is called Starfire, and it is when Hugh begins a much more direct combat usage type of attack with his star affinity, which he is very excited about. And the boulder was he's starting out for the different, test. The boulder was slowly crumbling as he shifted its feldspar crystals into alignment with one another. It took almost an hour to finish, and his crystal mana reservoir was almost entirely tapped out by the end, but he'd successfully extracted all of the feldspar crystals and formed them into their own smaller boulder. About time, Hugh. By midsummer, I expect you to be able to do that in 10 minutes or less. And evidently, this has been a longer, lesson than usual. And he is thinking maybe we're done. But then she says, I'm going to start you on instruction with your stellar affinity. And she's like, first thing you need to know is that it eats the fuck out of your mana. So anything you do, you're going to use way more mana for than anything else you do. Secondly, they hit really, really fucking hard. So anybody that is on your team is not going to be able to come close to this except for Talia, who is a special case. You're not going to become a frontline combatant. You're going to be able to do a ton of damage, but they are not efficient, and they will drain your mana dry. So they are emergency use only, friend. Do not think that you're just going to go into a regular battle like this. So here's a spell form. Try it out. And he does it, and this is so funny. He focused on the boulder. It had to be at least as tall as he was and twice as wide. So he extends his hand, and he channels his mana into the spell form. And it's a very intense pull on his mana. He is a little bit startled by it. And a sphere begins to develop in his hand. The instant the sphere was complete, it filled with something, then blasted forward out of his hand. Honestly, he couldn't tell what his affinity sense. He couldn't understand what his affinity senses were telling him about the contents of the sphere. It was blue-white in color and glowed bright enough to hurt his eyes, but you could tell the sphere actually dampened the glow. So, it took longer than most of the same sort of spells that Hugh had ever seen, but it blasts forward so fast that he can't follow it with his eyes, and it slams into the boulder and explodes. It took a minute for Hugh's vision to clear and for him to focus back on the boulder. The boulder had a small crater in the front of it, and the rock around the crater had visibly melted a bit, but for the most part, the boulder was undamaged. And he says, that's it. And I was like, I don't know, Hugh. It's not like the boulder just got broken. You melted it. That's crazy. And correctly, apparently, that because immediately Candarin starts laughing and is like, dude, that would be more than enough to kill a person. Granite's melting point is as high as steel. And you are, look at this, you absolutely did some real damage here. And Hugh is like, well, I don't know, Talia could do it. And Kandaran's like, yeah, and Talia is a fucking maniac monster child who is able to do shit she probably shouldn't be. So don't compare yourself to her. What are you doing? Like, just be glad that she's your friend and not your enemy, because she is super scary, actually. And she says that if it hadn't been contained, the starfire, it would have exploded and cooked him as soon as he generated it. So, yikes. For all the unusual size of your mana reservoirs, you're barely above the minimum needed to be able to use your stellar affinity. As your mana reservoirs grow, you'll find your stellar affinity to be more and more useful. It belongs to a category of affinities that are disproportionately more effective for powerful mages than weak ones. And I really am excited for him on this front, because like the way that his mana reservoirs work, it just feels like this will be an advantage for him, even though he's a little bit frustrated by it. It did drain like 2/3 of his mana, just that one shot. So she's not wrong, you know, but, yeah, it says she gave him new spell forms to practice before he left. One was a cantrip that shielded his eyes from the starfire so he wasn't left blinded when he cast a spell. He was supposed to share that one with his friends, but only after they saw the results of the starbolt for themselves. Kandaran was firmly convinced that humans needed a good reason to learn something or they wouldn't bother. Which, honestly, true. Like, yeah, that seems true. So chapter 22, we go to Sabae's perspective, and she is going to the council meeting chamber in order to speak to Ruthless the Red. And this is a really fun scene. So we get a few fun bits here. First of all, that she had expected the council chamber to be a lot more sort of like protected and secluded, and instead it's kind of out in the open. There are no walls or ceiling, merely seats for the 13 counselors arranged in a circle. And they're each basically a throne made of totally different materials that are meant to kind of show off the abilities of that mage. So Abila's is made of obsidian, Anders Velsraf's is draped in silk, Headmaster Tariq's is undressed rough stone, Ruthless the Red's is red at the center of a saltwater pool with a set of stepping stones leading to its base. One was made out of liquid water with fish living in it, one that appeared to be a living tree grown in the shape of a throne, another made of shifting, roiling sand, while another was hollow glass filled with unpleasant-looking green mists. And then there's the one that Kandaran sits on, which was really impressive. The only thing of note about the spot was that a huge, shallow bowl had been worn into the stone from centuries of Kandaran laying there. That was the kind of quiet statement of power that was really terrifying. And you guys, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to point out the repetitiveness of this author. I know that Hugh, oh my God. I know that Dan has assured me that he eventually grows out of this. But it happens quite a few times within these chapters. I'm not even going to mention all of them. But right here, that was the kind of quiet statement of power that was terrifying. And then he says it wasn't a bold monument to her power. It was a quiet statement. And I don't need you to reiterate that. And secondly, it let you know that Kandaran had been attending meetings here for centuries, long enough to wear away a bowl in the stone. Yeah, I got that. You don't need to iterate that to me either. That's like what you said to begin with was plenty. I didn't really need it to be hammered home. It let you know that no matter how powerful you were or how grander plans were, Kandaran wouldn't be impressed. She'd been there for half a millennium after all, and there was no reason to believe she wouldn't remain there for centuries more to come. And really, you could have cut out the whole second half of that paragraph and just ended with this. Like, I feel like there was just a better way to put this, because initially when he just says that it's a half bowl worn in the stone from where she's like been sitting over time, I was like, oh, nice. That is a very like high impact statement that is, as a reader, really kind of made me stop and go, wow, what insignificant humans we all are. But then he sort of like kept like just hammering on a spot that I was like, what you said already did that. You don't need to keep saying it in different words, or in not so different words either. Like, it's just a quiet statement is said twice, one on top of the other. So there's a few different times within this section, again, where almost identical words are used in sentences that are practically back to back. And I do not understand how he isn't catching these, because it is frequent. And it's just so noticeable to me that I find it really frustrating, because it takes me out of things, you know? And like overall, I would say the writing in this series is it's like the ideas are really great. And I think the writing doesn't live up to the concepts that he's got going on. So it's frustrating, because I want to sort of like let go and let myself enjoy things. And then he keeps having these moments of like getting hung up in his own favorite phrasings, or feeling like the audience maybe isn't going to get the point he's trying to make. So he has to repeat himself. And then it pulls me out of it again. And I just want him to like let it go a little bit more and trust that we get it. And also mix it up a little bit with your language. Like, he uses a lot of the same phrases over and over in the books in general, not just when he does it back to back. So that particular moment, I was really surprised at the fact that he felt he needed to like explain in depth why this was a quiet statement and how that would work. And I was like, that was pretty evident. So let's see. She's looking out at this view on this like huge mountain range. And as she's like checking this out, somebody says, impressive, isn't it? And she tries to like keep control of herself and not jump in surprise, which it seems like she succeeds in doing. And overall, Sabae seems like in this scene to be a lot more in control of the situation than anyone would expect from somebody of her youth, to be honest. Like, this scene is a really great lesson in how not speaking can work to your advantage. So Retless says something about the first time he came up here and blah, blah, blah. And there is like a chance that could come across as him sort of posturing, but really he just sounds like somebody who's like reliving a memory that, you know, is a nice bit of nostalgia. And for all that Sabae had come into the situation expecting to dislike the man on sight, he was fairly inoffensive looking. He was well-groomed and a little fussy looking. Again, with the looking, tell me what that means. Like, what does fussy looking mean? Don't say fussy looking, because that feels like you're telling me. Explain what that means. It's just that he's well-groomed? Like, that feels, you know. But I do appreciate he wasn't oily or greasy or shrewish or anything else Sabae had expected, though admittedly, those expectations are probably influenced by Talia's novels and her persistent idea the world should work the way they did, which I kind of do feel like was a pointed remark on J.K. Rowling, because she loves making characters who are unlikable also unattractive. And doing this in a very over-the-top Roald Dahl-esque way, which initially with her first books felt like it made sense with the kind of childlike universe. And then as things got more serious and the plotting became a little bit more grown up, she stuck with that kind of like using people's looks as a shorthand for what they're like as people. And it doesn't age super well. So anyway, I felt like he was really saying here, if you expected me to have this guy look a certain way because he's a human supremacist and you thought that meant something, maybe I'm not JK, so you don't need to do that. And I don't feel like that helps. I appreciate that because he's right. We don't need that. So in this scene, Rutless is the one who speaks the most, and Sabae kind of keeps herself to herself throughout a lot of it and lets him talk himself into a corner. So he has to meet to look at this budget, but it becomes pretty clear that this budget, which is about the budget for grandmother's visit, it becomes clear pretty quickly that this is not about that. They're meeting ostensibly for that, but really it's about the vote. And he says that he knows that's what's going on here. And he starts talking about Candoran for a moment. And because like Sabae expresses how this council meeting place is so open, and he says something about Candoran being able to set up defenses. If you were heading down the mountain, you could go down just fine. To traverse the same distance towards the top would take you days or weeks. Candoran did something to the space around this peak centuries ago. She altered it so that distance works differently depending on what direction you're traveling. The only reasonable way to get to the top is taking the stairs up, unless you're Candoran, in which case she flies in. And he's clearly got some resentment around this and is just like, she just likes to show off and remind us that we're lowly humans. And, you know, he's bringing out the sort of talking points for human supremacists here. And look, there are parts of what he says that I understand his feeling of like that people being ruled by beasts feels weird. I mean, as a regular person in a world where these kinds of creatures don't exist, it does feel kind of weird to me. But saying like, I think humans should be able to rule ourselves, I haven't learned enough about this world to know if the people in the regions he's describing as being ruled by creatures are oppressed. Because it seems like, at least when we're talking about Indris, for example, she had people who were clustering around her for the protection, for the wealth that poured off of what she was doing, people who worshipped her. This doesn't feel like folks who are being ground under the heel of the dragon. This feels like people who see an opportunity and capitalize on it. And that's not a problem. That's them doing something to make their own lives potentially better, hopefully other people's lives better. Like, the whole thing is just a really interesting... I wouldn't mind knowing more about the history of how all of this has worked and the way that he describes like humans being the playthings of those larger than us. And I'm like, I didn't see that being the case at all, you know, but I don't know the situation in a lot of these other areas. So it's possible maybe that is true in certain places. And let's see, her grandmother, Sabae, was fairly sure was currently the single greatest cause of shipwrecks on the continent. Still, there was always some dragon, sphinx, or deranged archmage convinced they could conquer a state that lacked a great power, so Rutless wasn't entirely wrong. And then he says, I know the real reason that Alestin sent you. It's not that I wouldn't be tempted by some sort of favor from Ilian Kayan Das. Or Ilinia. I keep saying her name wrong. I'd be a fool not to be. Ultimately, however, I must hold myself to higher ideals. I've been given a chance to work for the betterment of humanity itself, and I cannot put myself first. This line is so good. Sabae struggled not to sigh. What a petty, grubbing little attempt to try to raise the price on a bribe. I didn't realize that's what he was doing. I'll be perfectly honest. This is where I really start to feel like I would be so bad at these sorts of things because I am such a straightforward person that I don't pick up on some shit until you tell me directly. And this is where I start to be like, maybe I'm on the spectrum here somewhere. Because as I grow older and look back at different situations, I realize very clearly that I was being told without being told XYZ. And it literally never hit me until years had passed what was truly being said in that moment. And I just wasn't fucking picking up on it. So yeah, this bit of him being like, I understand once she says that and I take a moment and look at it, I'm like, oh, saying like, oh, I'd be tempted, but I mustn't. Of course that's what he's doing. But in the moment, I'm taking this at face value of like, I'm not interested. And I just felt like such a dodo because I absolutely didn't get it. And Sabae is like, this is so unsubtle. It's embarrassing. And I'm like, if I were Rutless and I said it like this, I would think I was being really slick. I would think I was so subtle and like careful. And Sabae is disgusted by how like obvious it is. And I'm just like, God, oh man. Yeah, I am not cut out for this kind of work at all. So then we have this weird moment where his satchel has this little green pill in it. And she's like looking at it and he says, I'll never be rid of those. My predecessor as bursar was more than a little unhinged. He took these for his nerves, but I'm fairly sure they only made things worse. I've been finding them all over my office for years, and no matter how many times I think I've finally seen the last of them, more just keep showing up. And I don't know, man, but there's something about that feels like either it's like part of potentially Bakori's influence on him to not take them, or this was something that the other guy took to protect himself from it. I don't know what the deal is, but there's something very significant about this. Does she keep it? I feel like she puts it in her pocket or something. I don't remember. But anyway, she says then, it seems like your motives are really high-minded. And he starts to like play along. And then she drops this fucking hammer and is basically like, you know, it's really funny because you seem to be under the impression that Kandaron is like leaning on you when in fact Kandaron is keeping us, the Kandas, from coming down on you about what a pain in the ass you're being the way we would if she weren't in the way. It's really gonna be an issue for you if you don't fall into line. And she takes this letter, and I'm going back here. He pulled out a sealed letter. The spellform imprinted seal was, of course, red. And I don't know if, like, what exactly it says in this letter, but she's saying to him, like, my grandmother's going to read it and she's going to be really interested. And I don't know if this is supposed to be, like, some of what he is demanding as part of the bribe or what. Regardless, she just completely leaves him with his, like, jaw flapping in the wind because he thought he was coming up here to sort of, I think, put terms down in front of a kid who was going to just capitulate, and he didn't know who the fuck he was dealing with. And Sabae is like determined to earn her place among her people as somebody worthy of respect. So she's not here to tiptoe around and be friendly. And honestly, I think that her grandmother would have been pretty fucking proud of her in this moment. So speaking of her grandmother, we will go to their meeting. And Sabae is like, very nervous. It is so precious how completely she is on edge. And we have the ship, which is called, what is it called? Like this pile of junk. But Hugh, they're all like waiting at the marina, I guess. Is that the way to say it? The docks. And the ship is like coming in really fast. It turns out that her grandmother just literally makes dunes part out of their way. Like she doesn't want to slide up and over them. She's like, no, why would I do that? Just get out of my fucking way. And I was like, that is really badass. And Hugh just keeps being impressed at like the extent of power that would be necessary for creating that path in the sand to happen and for making the dunes part and everything. So Sabae had told him a lot about that old pile of junk. It had been constructed especially for her grandmother as a gift by a past prince of Rossandis. She'd lived through 3 of their reigns, and since the Candace family essentially propped up their rule, the ruling family was very attentive to her needs. And I love that it's called that old pile of junk, especially considering that I was listening to the audiobook for this section, and I didn't get that when he says that old pile of junk initially, that's the name of the ship. It's only italicized in the text, so you know from that context, but it's never explicitly said. So when it keeps on being called that, I was like, why is he saying that? And then I finally started to figure out, oh, that's the actual name. That's amazing. So yeah, this thing is like an incredibly expensive ship, so it being called that old pile of junk is extra funny. And it comes into port at a way higher speed than most sand ships do. So a lot of people start to kind of panic and get out of the way. And then it says he'd been expecting a tall, regal looking older version of Sabae, honestly, probably dressed in fine robes and jewelry. And I'll be honest, I kind of vacillated between that and picturing like Fisher Gesha from Cradle. And a kind of combo of like a Fisher Gesha plus like the Queen of Thorns. And I began to really zero in on more of like a Queen of Thorns vibe based on what I had heard. And so her appearance wasn't entirely a surprise, but I didn't expect for her to be like a mess, which is really what she is. It's one thing to be like a small sort of shrunken old woman who is hunched over. It's another thing for your hair to be very flyaway, for your clothing to be like stained and old. She's got like this necklace that's got big chunky coral beads on it, and I'm like wondering if the necklace is enchanted or if it's like a personal. She seems like the kind of person that set of coral beads is actually a necklace that like a granddaughter made her, that has absolutely no magical anything attached to it, and that it's simply important to her on a sentimental level. Like there is something about her that makes me think that she is way more sentimental than anybody would think because of how strong she is. And it feeling as if, oh, well, power is all that matters to her. But I don't know. I've got a feeling, especially because when she yells at Sabae for looking so nervous, and when Sabae calls her ma'am, she says, I'm your granny. And the fact that she says that, and then Sabae calls her grandmother and she seems disappointed, I was like, yeah, I don't know. I feel like this is a lady who, she has grown so accustomed to this power that this isn't really the draw for her anymore. I feel like her actual family and legacy through her children and grandchildren it's not just about like, oh, we have to maintain our dynasty. It feels like it's about them as people for her in more of a way than I was really expecting. And I liked how cordial she was with Sabae, wanting her to call her granny, not be so nervous, and just generally like she felt much more friendly and warm than I was expecting. And she goes up to each of them and takes them by the ear and like yanks on them. Hugh is the first, and she's basically, first of all, like, I heard about you and you've done some amazing work. And she says, I enjoyed watching you work in Theristel, which remains an unsolved mystery by the end of this section because we do not know how she saw him do what he does. And then, of course, Candoran had to go and make sure to claim you for herself, didn't she? Pity. If you ever change your mind about working with her, you're always welcome to Rassandus. And then Godric, I love her. She didn't mention you were tall. She did mention that you were tall, but not that you were this unnecessarily tall. I love when she says, you're entirely too tall. It's rude. That is so good. And then she goes over to Talia, and Talia says, I will bite you. Oh, good for you. And Ilinia is delighted. She just starts cracking up and is like, okay, this is my favorite one. And then some counselor is like, I want to formally welcome you. And she basically like puts her suitcase in his hands and is like, hey, would you take care of this? And just walks away as she's talking to Sabae. And it's just like, we've got a lot of catching up to do, dearie. And I was just all about this. And we find out later that Sabae starts missing classes and stuff. Like she's got so much going on with her grandmother that they're not seeing a lot of her. So I can't wait to find out what's going on with that. So now chapter 24, and I'm like out of time. So I'm going to do my best, and I'm mad because I'm out of time. I tried so hard, but there was so much jammed into these chapters. We have this moment where Hugh is walking out of class, and he is just sort of caught up in his head about everything that's going on and how they haven't really made any progress with like figuring out who the traitor is, and he's just really sort of spacing out, concerned about everything going on. So this is when he has the encounter with Candoran, and when she says, do you trust me? When Midsummer arrives, you and the others need to go into the labyrinth again. And then she just flies away. And that is when he is so distracted that Rhodes catches him by surprise. And I love it. He's like, Rhodes comes up behind him and puts his hand on his shoulder. And he reacts with this move that he's been taught in case of physical combat when you've run out of mana for spells, and tosses Rhodes and starts to run. But Rhodes, when he's running, Rhodes calls out please with this like desperation that causes him to stop finally. And Rhodes looks like shit when Hugh comes back and looks at him. He is a mess. His clothes look like they've been slept in. He's got bags under his eyes. He's lost weight. And finally, Rhodes just says, I'm not a coward. And it turns out this is such a weird scene, and I really like it. Don't get me wrong, because it feels very realistic. I'm hoping for Rhodes to be like, hey, I'm sorry that I treated you the way that I did. And that's just not how bullies fucking are. Like, you may occasionally see somebody come to their senses and realize, but for the most part, people who are bullies are like that because they have things about themselves that they don't want to look at, and they're pushing outward onto people based on some like refusal to deal with their own shit is a lot of what that is about. So because you have a lot of personality types that are lacking in self-awareness, they also don't have a lot of empathy, and they grow up never fully taking responsibility for the things that they did, or never really wanting to acknowledge how damaging their actions really were. And they want to treat it all as if it were just a joke and you're overreacting because they don't want to see themselves as the bad guy. And here, what is so wild to me is that he wants to talk to Hugh not about how he treated him, but about how he behaved in the labyrinth itself, and not because it was the wrong thing to do, although that is part of it. It's more that it was the wrong thing to do, and Rhodes never would have handled himself that way because it's dishonorable. And the thing that kills me is that he is so concerned over the fact that his position in his family has taken a hit due to what the episode has done to his reputation. It's like, now that he has been revealed as somebody who will start a fight and run away and not help, everybody is very disillusioned about him. And he is much more upset over that than he is at the fact that he was just tormenting Hugh on a daily basis. And so he's like insistent on the fact that he isn't a coward. But the thing is, yeah, he still is. And later on, when he's like, so wait, you think this was Bakori making me do this and that I'm not a coward? Hugh says to him, you're not a coward. And I was like, that's not true. And I don't think you should say it. Coming up against a kid who has no magical abilities with two of your friends flanking you is cowardly. Whether or not the whole thing in the labyrinth happened the way that it did, that's still the actions of a coward. And it's really interesting, too, about the fact that he's talking about how, like, he was always really good at everything growing up. He was like, you know, his parents didn't even think they could have a kid, and then they have him, and he's like amazing at picking up on everything he has to learn. And then he has magic, and it turns out he has fucking 5 affinities. And then Hugh was like, then why did you feel the need to make my life hell? Because it was funny. And he says this more than once. And even at one point says, I'm not sorry about what I did to you. I'm sorry about the labyrinth. It felt like I wasn't even myself. So again, the actual thing that fucked up Hugh, the daily torment, Rhodes does not apologize for at all. It's more that this one deciding moment that seemed to ruin his brand is haunting him. And he is trying, and I'm not really sure what he was hoping to have happen here. If, like, he thought maybe Hugh could rehabilitate his image or what. But, yeah, he is trying to, like, explain himself to Hugh in a way that I'm like, man, you are so missing the point. And then I'm not even sure why Aiden bothers to keep me on anymore. He keeps talking about earning my redemption, but every time the goal seems to have moved a little farther away. I think he enjoys my misery. Fitting, really, given how I treated you. Aiden loves talking about you, by the way. The apprentice I abandoned in the labyrinth has become the famous one, while I'm just known as a coward. Not a day goes by that I don't hear about the deeds of the Storm Ward. And this is when he was like, so are you apologizing for the way you treated me last year? Honestly, I really don't feel bad about that. It really was funny. And I was astonished that Hugh doesn't kind of let him have it. Hugh explains to him about Bakori. And look, I am not mad at Hugh in principle for giving Rhodes an out. I understand just wanting to tell him the truth about the whole thing with Bakori and be like, it's not your imagination that you were suddenly not acting like yourself. There was something going on here. But there is the fact that Hugh doesn't sort of stop him and be like, so you're only here to apologize about the thing that ruined your life. Well, then fuck you. I really wish that he had done that. He just gives him so much leeway without really holding him accountable in a way that felt significant to me. And the only thing that I did appreciate was you being like, I don't know why Aiden wouldn't have told you that Bakori was probably part of it, unless he just enjoys tormenting you. And a part of me was sort of like, maybe Aiden knows. Like, this chapter ends with Hugh saying, I'm about to add another deed to my legend. And then I now know, he says to himself, he knew who the traitor was. Rhodes had just blown the investigation right open. So I don't know what about this means that he knows who the traitor is, if it's Aiden. But if that's true, I miss the significance of whatever it was that Rhodes was saying. And also, it would be kind of funny to me if Aiden just realized that Rhodes was a huge douchebag and was like, oh, no, yeah, it probably was Bakori influencing him, but this kid is a fucking dickhead. So you know what? I'm going to let him sit with this, and I'm going to let his reputation be ruined because he really deserves to be taken down several pegs. And I want to be mad at an adult who's in a position of authority, like abusing this information to hold it over this kid's head, but I really can't be that mad at it because fuck Rhodes forever. And like I said, as much as I wanted Rhodes to really apologize in a real way, this feels very, very, very realistic to me. So I was kind of like, I was a bit appreciative of the way John Bierce decided to handle this conversation. It makes a lot of sense to me. But yeah, that is the end of chapter 24. So I am way over time. I'm going to have to wrap. I'm sorry, you guys. I see you all talking in the chat and I want to address everything you're saying, but I just didn't have time. This was a really, really fat section. But yeah, I'm really, really curious what it is about this convo that has Hugh running down the hall. Like, I've solved it. I don't know. I missed something. So, all right, guys, I'm going to wrap. Thank you guys again so much. I appreciate you all. Until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.